Football Central Radio Network. I am your host, Aaron Freeman, joined by my co-host, Scott Karasik. Today we are reviewing the Falcons 2018 draft. We're going to be talking about all six of their draft prospects. We're going to be talking about possible upgrades to their defensive tackle position. And of course, we'll be answering your mailbag questions throughout the show. So, Scott, let's get things started. The Falcons took six players. First round pick, Calvin Ridley, wide receiver from Alabama. Second round pick, Isaiah Oliver, cornerback from Colorado. Third round pick was defensive tackle, Deadrin Senat from South Florida. Fourth round pick, they took Ito Smith, the running back from Southern Miss. Sixth round pick, they traded up to get Russell Gage, the wide receiver for LSU. And they also finished their draft in the sixth round with Foye Olakun, the linebacker from Yale. So let's get this thing started by sort of your general thoughts on this draft. Do you feel like the Falcons filled all their needs that they needed to in this draft? And do you think that they needed to fill all their needs via the draft?
I think they filled the important needs with this draft. I think they filled the nose tackle spot. I think they filled that nickel cornerback. I know a lot of people do like Brian Poole, but he needed to be upgraded. I think they filled their receiver role because they did need depth behind Jones, Sanu, and Hardy, and then eventually Ridley. And then they got a running back that was my personal favorite draft because he just reminds me of Devontae Freeman. So I think they did really well. I think they got the right guys that fit what they need. And then they've got some really interesting players. I think the only thing they didn't really get was the fullback. And we'll see what happens there.
Okay. Yeah, I think they hit most of their needs. I think that I would have preferred to get another D tackle or some form of a defensive lineman, either to play that Shelby role or to also slide in beside Senat and Grady Jarrett in addition to their draft picks. But I think they did a pretty decent job. I think they were able to address some areas that we needed to see sort of starting caliber players added with D tackle and quarterback and get some depth with wide receiver and running back. So I think they were able to, obviously, they drafted Ridley high enough where he's not necessarily going to be seen, at least long term, as a depth piece. But speaking of Calvin Ridley, sort of what were your thoughts when the Falcons selected Calvin Ridley? I know it was, it took me by surprise. I did not see that coming at all. I think it's probably the biggest surprise in the first round that I can remember from the Falcons. What were your thoughts on that Ridley pick?
I love the Ridley pick. He's the best receiver in the draft. He's by far going to bring more than what Taylor Gabriel brought to the offense. Love Taylor Gabriel. I just think he's a better fit. And I think Ridley as a whole will give Atlanta a true number two that will complement Julio perfectly.
Okay. Well, we got several mailbag questions about Calvin Ridley. The first one comes from John Kevin Hong. He says, Ridley reminds me of OBJ, fast, versatile, and yet lacks physicality. Am I wrong in my assessment of Ridley? Also, with the addition of Ridley and Greg Knapp, how much do you think this offense will improve under Sark? Man, I really hope Dumb Quinn is right about Sark. I guess people still are not too thrilled about Dan Quinn, I guess, so that's interesting. But what are your thoughts on that question, Scott?
One, Dan Quinn's probably the best coach we've ever had in Atlanta. Two, Ridley is, fast, versatile, yet lacks physicality. I don't think he lacks physicality. I just think he's small. And he's not OBJ. He's more Reggie Wayne. And Reggie Wayne wasn't the most physical receiver either, but he won with route running, he won with speed, he won with smart, finding the zone area, or with his smarts, finding the holes in the zones of defense. So I think that is what really is. And I think Knapp is going to help Sark. Because I think Sark needed someone who could help him game plan at quarterback's coach. Bush Hamden was a high school coach before he got here. So I don't think he was the right guy. or not a high school coach, but he was like a mid-level college coach. I don't think he was the right.
Okay. Yeah, I like, I do think physicality is an issue for Ridley. I think he's competitive, but I don't think he's physical. I think there's a difference between those things. I think, he has a competitive streak, so he tries. But, he's a 189-pound receiver that plays kind of like a 180-pound receiver. And so he's not going to be necessarily physical. I think a good comparison for Ridley is Nelson Aguilar. And I think that's really sort of the style of player he is. I think the expectation is that Ridley will be better than Aguilar, but I think sort of on that sort of spectrum, and you mentioned Reggie Wayne, I think he's closer to Marvin Harrison in terms of what type of player he's going to be, not to suggest that he's going to be a Hall of Famer or anything like that, but I think in terms of that undersized guy that wins with precise route running and can separate from coverage, I think that's more of a Marvin Harrison type of player. So I think Ridley will help improve this offense because I do think for various reasons the Falcons won't hold him back in the same way that I think they held back Taylor Gabriel last year. And I think so basically what the offense should have been a year ago under Sark, I think we'll see that this year because I do think Ridley will be able to fill that void in that role that Gabriel was supposed to have this past season when, a lot of people thought that the Falcons had one of the best wide receiver core in the league. So I think that should be the case. We'll see that more evidently in this season. As for Greg Knapp's help, yeah, sure. I don't know how much, the improvement's going to come to that, but if there's a significant improvement, I'm sure plenty of people will say it's because of Greg Knapp's presence, and, they won't really have proof to prove that, but we can go with that or something like that. So, yeah, we'll see how it works out. Brandon Rich at Brand the Builder asked, Sark coach Ridley one game and thought the best way to use him was a wide receiver screen from a trips bunch. Is all this what we have to look forward to?
Boy, I mean, when your quarterback is who? Jalen Hurts? Probably that would be all we'd have to look forward to. He has Matt Ryan as his quarterback now. I think we'll be fine. I think we're going to see Calvin Ridley run a lot of the same routes that Taylor Gabriel ran last year and in 16. And we'll see him run a lot of the same routes that Julio runs. A lot of those short slants, a lot of those deep unders, deep under crossers, a lot of the deep balls that you'll see Julio get. I mean, he can do any route. And that is something that you need with a guy like Matt Ryan. And Ridley's best routes are the same kind of routes that Julio's best routes are. It's those in-breaking routes towards the middle of the field where he's lined up out wide and he cuts in on that slant or he cuts in on that deep dig. He cuts in on that post. And when Matt Ryan's throwing at his best, that's his best throw, is that deep dig, that deep post, that slant. So for me, I think Sark's going to be fine. Because Matt Ryan's going to go, hey, Sark, this is what I want in my offense. This guy can do everything Julio can do in terms of route running. So I want him to do the same kind of route Julio, which makes him that much.
Yeah, I think you're right, Scott. Like, you look at Ridley, and those dig routes are really something that he does extremely well. That was something that Gabriel did really well in 2016. We didn't really see him run any of those last year. And so it goes back to what I was sort of saying, like all the things that we should have seen from Taylor Gabriel last year that we didn't because the Falcons, for reasons, decided that they only wanted to run jet sweep, screen pass, and deep post with Gabriel and a couple of crossers on some shallow drag routes. I think we'll see a much more expanded usage of Ridley because you can certainly make the case that he's better route runner than Taylor Gabriel. But I think they're sort of similar in terms of what they bring to the table, which they are speed guys that do a good job separating. I think Taylor Gabriel is an underrated route runner. But, I certainly think Ridley is a really good route runner. And so we'll see the versatility that we probably should have seen last year with Ridley. So I don't think, I hope, we're not going to see Ridley limited to sort of, screens and jet sweeps and whatnot. So, I don't think that's going to be much of an issue, Brandon. Next question on Ridley is Digital Demon Yeah, so does Ridley play in the slot mostly in his rookie year? And do you see him breaking ankles like Marvin Harrison used to?
Yeah, but I don't think he plays mostly in the slot. I think he'll play a little bit of everywhere. Um, he's not just a slot receiver. He's not just an outside receiver. He's not just a left side or a right side or a in trips bunch, the middle guy. Like he can do anything as a wide receiver. What's great about Ridley is how polished he is already, and that is something that Atlanta needed. Yeah, he's a little older for a rookie, but he's also coming in the most polished rookie I've seen in a while.
Yeah, I don't expect Ridley to play a ton in the slot as a rookie because I think that's where Sanu lives and breathes. I think we'll see Ridley play some in the slot, but I think primarily he'll probably be an outside guy. I'll be curious to sort of see where the Falcons slot Ridley in, whether it's as the X or the Z wide receiver right now. With Gabriel gone, who was the primary backup to the X wide receiver spot, you have an opening there because Sanu and Hardy are more Z guys. But I think long term, Ridley's going to be the Z. So you wonder if the Falcons are going to say, okay, well, immediately, Ridley, we need you to play the X, but we're also going to cross train you to play the Z a little bit because we know next year you're going to be playing the Z almost exclusively, or in potentially also dabbling in that Y slot role when the Falcons push certain, starting wide receiver out the door next offseason. And it'll be interesting to sort of see where they do that. So I think we'll see a lot of cross training, as Scott said. I think we'll see him playing all across multiple wide receiver positions this summer. But he may primarily, early on, at least be that X behind Julio Jones, as opposed to the primary slot guy. Okay, let's talk about the next Falcons pick. And unless you have any additional thoughts on Calvin Ridley, Scott.
No.
Okay. The next Falcons pick was second round pick, Isaiah Oliver. A lot of people think this was one of the better values in this draft class, given that many people saw him as a first round talent. And the Falcons wound up getting him all the way at pick 58 in the latter part of round 2. Scott, what were your thoughts on Isaiah Oliver's selection?
His film was like peak Jalen Collins in Atlanta, like 2016 playoffs Jalen Collins. So for a Pac-12 guy, that's pretty good. And I don't know, he was just fun to watch. He's really good on deep balls. He can track the ball so well. I don't know if it's his decathlon training or what it is, but that dude can track a ball in the air and knock it away. And I love watching that. And I think using him, I think they drafted him to go directly against either Mike Evans or Michael Thomas or those bigger receivers and just let Trufant handle someone else. Because Trufant has trouble with Thomas and Evans and the bigger, stronger receivers.
Yeah. The Falcons clearly did not have a lot of size at the cornerback position, particularly when they decided to get rid of Jalen Collins and C.J. Goodwin and Deji Olatoye last season. And so getting a big corner like Isaiah Oliver makes a lot of sense. The thing about Oliver, he's not the tallest guy. He's like a 6'1" or something like that, but he's really got long arms. I think he's like 98th percentile in terms of wingspan, like 96th percentile in terms of arm length with those like 33 plus inch arms. So, and that's one of the reasons why he's so good on deep passes, just because he's able to really show off those ball skills and break up those passes. So I think this was a great pick for the Falcons because I do think this was a very underrated need for the Falcons, given that they were one injury away from being forced to play Bleedy Ray Wilson or Justin Bethel on the outside this season, which could have had significant negative ramifications for their defense because it would have forced them to not be able to rely as much on man coverage on third downs as this team has done when they've had guys like Alford and Trufant in the lineup, as well as Brian Poole. I think Oliver probably could push Brian Poole for the nickel spot, but I don't think that's really something the Falcons are going to rush him into. But I do think we'll see him get some opportunities early in the season. Unlike a Jalen Collins, I think Oliver's far more advanced coming into the league than Jalen Collins was. And so I do think, unlike that, we should see Oliver come in. Like if he had to be the nickel this year as a rookie, I think he could do it. But I think because of the presence of Brian Poole, the Falcons aren't going to necessarily rush him into the lineup and use him sort of as a matchup guy when we do go up against some of these bigger wide receivers. You look at the Saints wide receiver group, Cameron Meredith, Michael Thomas, and now they got Traquan Smith. All those guys are 6'2", 6'3", so they needed some size at that position. I think Oliver really helps address that. We got some questions about Isaiah Oliver. First one comes from Jason at your boy J94. He asks, how good can Oliver be, CB1 or Jalen Collins 2.0?
Well, he's not going to be Jalen Collins 2.0 because he doesn't have the off-field questions that Collins had. Could he eventually be a CB1 when Trufant leaves? Yeah, very much so. So I've got no problems with the idea of Oliver being a CB1. Worst case scenario, he's a long-term CB2 like Alford is. What's the worst that can happen in that situation? Oh, you have to go out and draft the CB1 to eventually replace Trufant.
Yeah, well, I think he has the potential to be a CB1. I think the beautiful thing about him being in Atlanta is he doesn't necessarily have to be that guy, at least not in the early portion of his career, because you do have guys like Trufant and Alford, and so you can sort of bring him along. I think probably long term he's a CB2. At some point, I think the Falcons over the next 2 or so years will probably move on from Robert Alford just as a cap cutting cost measure, and I think having a guy like Oliver on the defense, assuming that he develops over the next year or two, makes that sort of decision a little bit easier for the team in terms of sort of turning the page, similar to what we saw several years ago when we went from Asante Samuel to Robert Alford. So I think sense for the Falcons, but I think probably for the most part, Oliver only really has to be a high-level CB3 for the short term, and then eventually can transition into a CB2, when he gets that opportunity a couple of years down the road. All right, so the next question comes from Digital Demon. So from my film study I have seen thus far, it seems Oliver will play mostly on the outside. So does that mean that on nickel sets we will kick Alford inside?
That's what I would think. I would go Alford over Trufant inside just because I think Alford's a better fit for it. But, I mean, either one of those guys should go inside.
Yeah, I think that's probably what makes the most sense. Oliver is primarily an outside guy, and I think you'll probably see Alford kick inside more. I think there's certain maybe games and matchups that you might see Trufant if it's a team that has their number one guy, like say in Arizona, where Larry Fitzgerald is their number one guy, and he plays primarily from the slot. So in those instances, you might say, okay, put Trufant in the slot in this game, as opposed to Alford. But yeah, I think eventually when you see those three guys on the field, you're going to see Alford inside, and Trufant and Oliver on the outside. Okay, our next question comes from at the Dirty Bird 1998, aka Luke. He asks, more likely to play dime against tight ends, Oliver or Foye, our 6th-round pick he's referring to, or do we stick with Keanu?
I think Keanu. And I think the dime corner or whatever is going to be cool. I don't think you're going to have anybody other than Poole in that role.
Yeah, I think more than likely what you're going to see is Oliver probably will be the 6 DB. I think Foye is more of a special teams guy. I think he has the potential to play that role down the road, but I don't think right now the Falcons really intend for him to really do much of anything on defense other than just sort of learn this year and play special teams. So I think when the Falcons go 6 DBs, last year we saw that from time to time, and in those opportunities they went with a fourth cornerback more often than not. But I think with Casey's development, With Oliver's addition, I think the Falcons do have some versatility and some flexibility there that, particularly against tight ends, they can go in multiple directions because, Oliver has the size that you want at that spot. And that was something that the Falcons often did with Deji Olatoye back in 2016, was that he was asked to cover tight ends due to his size advantage over some of the other DBs that the Falcons had. So I do think that's an option for them with Oliver. I think, if maybe they're smaller, quicker guys and they do play some dime there, then I think maybe KZ might be an option there just because he has a little bit more speed and quickness to match up with some of those guys as well. Okay, let's move on to the next Falcons pick. That's third-round pick Deadrin Senat, the defensive tackle from South Florida. Scott, what were your thoughts on this selection?
I loved it. I thought there were like 3 good defensive tackles available, and I was going to be happy with any of them, just because you can never have enough good nose tackles, and Atlanta definitely needed one. And Deadrin Senat, I mean, you see a lot of Grady Jarrett in this game. I'm not saying he is Grady Jarrett. I'm just saying you see a lot of it in this game, especially when Grady's playing one technique and is holding down the fort and taking on double teams, and you're like, well, this guy's just doing all the dirty work. Senat is a dirty work player. That is what he is. That is what he's going to be doing. That is where he's going to throw. So I think long-term, he's starting nose tackle. I think short-term, he may also start base, but I think in nickel we're going to see a lot of Jack Crawford and Grady Jarrett.
Yeah, I think Senat's a good fit. I think he's a really solid player for the Falcons. I think we're going to see him quite a bit in base this season. I think he might dabble in nickel just because I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to be playing Jack Crawford for, I don't even know, like 700 snaps. I just don't see that as a likely possibility. That you would typically expect out of a defensive tackle that primarily plays base. So I do think Senat will get a healthy workload in that role, but I don't necessarily think that's really where the Falcons envision him long term. But we'll see what he does. I think what Senat does, and I'm not necessarily huge on the Grady Jarrett comparisons. I think they're just games are too different to really make that comparison. I think it changes perceptions and expectations for what Senat will be long term. I think Senat is more of a power guy, and thus he's going to be more of a run defender. He will be able to contribute as a pass rusher. And I think if I was to compare Senat to a former Falcon defensive tackle, I think Vance Walker is a better comparison for him in terms of what his potential was. I know Vance Walker didn't blossom here in Atlanta as he had went elsewhere in Oakland and Kansas City and was a much more effective player as a role player and starter, but I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Falcons had invested higher round picks in other players. But when you actually went back and watched the tape over Vance Walker's first couple of years here, he was actually better than Corey Peters and better than Perret Jerry when he actually saw time on the field. But for political reasons, I guess you could say, he wasn't necessarily getting the playing time that he deserved. So I do think that's more of what Deadrin Senat is probably going to be. Certainly, I think he has the potential to be better than that. But I think in terms of what my expectations for what he'll bring to the table in terms of the Falcons rotation, I think it's more of a Vance Walker type than a Grady Jarrett type that's going to be an every down difference maker. We got some questions about Deadrin Senat, of course. Jason at your boy J94 asked, Matt Miller said he had a 7th round grade on Senat. Is he athletic enough to fit our D-line?
He's one of the more athletic nose tackle prospects this year. I mean, I have no problem with him in the middle of the D-line. I don't think he's athletic enough to play 80% of the snaps and be effective there, but I think he's more than athletic enough to play in the base and run the base nose tackle spot, which is what they really needed because they have Crawford for the nickel. And I think that's the goal, is to have Crawford run a lot of nickel.
Yeah, I think Senat is a good athlete for his size. I don't think he's like this world-class athlete. He certainly doesn't, measure up to a guy like Taven Bryan. As for Matt Miller having a 7th round grade on him, okay, cool. I'd be curious where Matt Miller had a grade on BJ Hill because I think Deadrin Senat's better than BJ Hill, but apparently I seem to be in the minority of that opinion for quite some time. Now, seems like more people are coming around to that now that Senat is on the team and they're actually watching him play. Yeah, I probably had a fourth or fifth round grade on Senat, so like I get the seventh round grade. I don't quite agree with it, but like it's a day three grade. Just mine's a little bit more higher on the high end than on the low end. Similar to what Scott just said, Luke at the Dirty Bird 1998 asked, better pass rusher in 2018, Senat or Crawford? Will we get into the season with only 3 defensive tackles?
I don't think they finished training camp with just 3 defensive tackles that seem like legit options on the roster. I think someone else is coming. It's easily going to be Crawford, better pass rusher.
Yeah. I think, we'll see where Senat is by the end of the year, but I think certainly starting out the season, Crawford's going to be the guy. And so we'll just have to wait and see what Senat's development is as far as that pass rush. You look at guys like Tack McKinley, where Tack started strong and finished really strong, or had a good preseason, I should say. And then, we saw improvement from his game over the course of the season. You commonly see that. You saw that with Vic Beasley. You saw that with Grady Jarrett as well. So certainly there's going to be room for growth for Senat to improve over the course of the season. But certainly early in the season, I think it's going to be Jack Crawford. And, my expectation is that, I don't know. I mean, like, the funny thing we always say is, like, whatever the Falcons' defensive line rotation is at the beginning of the season, you can pretty much count on it not being the case at the end of the season. So I think we might see another season like that where there is potential for some changes during the middle portion of the year. Similar question. Digital Demon asked, do you think Senat will see any third downs, or is his ceiling just a 2-down defensive tackle?
I think long term he could eventually see some third downs, but he's got to really fix his hand usage.
Yeah, I think we'll see him play some third downs this year. I do think long term he's like more of a 2.5 down player than a 2-down player, because I do think he can dabble as a pass rusher, but I don't think he's the sort of. I don't expect the Falcons to say, oh, we don't necessarily need to draft a pass rushing defensive tackle at any point in the next 3 years because we just drafted Deadrin Senat. That's what I'll say. Like, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Falcons use their number 1 pick next year on a defensive tackle. So, we'll see what happens over the next 12 months to see whether that prediction comes true or anything like that. But, I think Senat probably long-term will primarily be more of a 2-down player than a 3-down player. But I do think he has the ability to dabble as a pass rusher when the Falcons, need to give other guys a breather. Okay, Scott, let's move on to the Falcons' first day 3 selection, and that was none other than Ito Smith, the running back out of Southern Miss. You mentioned earlier that he was your favorite running back in the draft. Why was that?
Because he's basically Devontae Freeman. I mean, I love Ito Smith. I think he's a great running back. I think he does everything that you want. And the only knock on him is the same thing that was a knock on Devontae, which is his size.
I think there's a lot of Devontae and Ito. I think he's more of a vision, quickness, lateral agility, balance, patience, that type of runner. We'll sort of see where his development in the zone blocking scheme goes from here, but I do think there is reason to be very optimistic about his ability to be a effective running back in this scheme, given his ability. The one knock on him is the size, or one of the knocks on him is the size, which means that he's not necessarily going to be a tackle breaker. But Devontae Freeman is not really a tackle breaker, and that's not really holding him back. You don't necessarily need to be this Michael Turner type of running back or this Todd Gurley type of running back to be a very effective running back in the NFL. I think the other concern with Ito Smith is ball security, just because the way he runs, he typically holds the ball away from his body. He typically holds it in one arm as opposed to being able to switch between both arms. And so I think that's something that he's going to have to be trained up and coached up to do. I don't see any reason why he won't be. We saw with Tevin Coleman, that was an issue for him when he came into the league. We saw him struggled with turnovers and ball security his rookie year. Hasn't really been an issue since then. So like it's not necessarily a concern, but it is something to keep an eye on, at least early in his career, whether that is something that becomes a little bit of an issue. Um, Moving on to the questions about Ito Smith. The first one comes from Brian at your homeboy Brian. He asks, "Do you think the running back we drafted has the potential to be Tevin Coleman's possible replacement in 2019, or most likely somebody that could take Teron Ward's spot?"
I mean, he's like the most badass version of what Ward could have been. So yeah, he's easily taken Ward's spot this year, and then I think in 2019 he could take Tevin's role.
Yeah, I think the key with Ito Smith and whether or not he's going to carve out a significant role. I think the Falcons did draft him for the sake of having an insurance policy in case they do not resign Tevin Coleman, which is probably likely at this point, but I don't think it's a guarantee at this point. We'll sort of have to see how the 2018 season plays out before anybody makes any long-term decisions about the Falcons running back position. But I do think the key for Ito Smith is going to be whether or not he can be trustworthy in pass protection. I think he's a good pass protector for a 5'9", 200-pound college running back, but that certainly doesn't mean that he's ready to be a contributor in that arena in the NFL when you're going to be blocking for your potentially $130 million quarterback or whatever it is, $150 million quarterback. So, like, I wouldn't trust him quite yet there. He's got to prove some things there. So I think if he does do that, if he does show that he's capable as a pass protector and he can sort of be interchangeable with a Devontae Freeman or with a Tevin Coleman on those passing downs, as we've seen with the last 2 years with Freeman and Coleman, I do think we could see him get a significant role. If he doesn't do that, then probably what he'll be limited to is what Tevin Coleman was his rookie season, which was a guy that sort of just only comes in to spell Devontae Freeman. And in that instance, Tevin Coleman was only basically getting like 3 touches a game. And I think in that case, Ito Smith is only going to get like 3 to 5 touches a game just to basically, like, when Freeman needs a breather, Ito Smith comes in and then he comes out. But if he does show that he can be a capable pass protector, then I think you could sort of see him be more of a 8 to 10 touch guy. I don't expect him to be a 10 to 15 touch guy that Tevin Coleman is right now, where it's basically the offense is interchangeable between Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman. But I do think Ito Smith certainly next year could be a guy that could be a component of the Falcons offense, get some opportunities. I think he just certainly has Tevin Coleman's like abilities in the passing game. I think he's a natural receiver. I think his speed and his route running ability shows that he can be that guy that can sort of split out wide and do some things as an outside guy, like we've seen with Tevin Coleman. He's not nearly as fast as Tevin Coleman, but nobody is on this team. And so I think, we could see a little bit of that Tevin Coleman role, but I don't think it's going to be like all of a sudden Ito Smith's going to be getting like 150 carries and catching 40 passes or anything like that next season. But, we could see maybe half of those numbers type of production from him in 2019. I think we already answered Digital Demon's question. Let's move on to the Falcons. First of the Falcons' 2 6th-round picks in Russell Gage, the wide receiver, former cornerback from LSU. Scott, what were your thoughts on this Russell Gage selection?
When I first saw it, I was like, who the hell is Russell Gage, and why did the Falcons take him in the 6th round after trading up? After watching him, I realized that Danny Etling is just so friggin' bad that this kid could not stand out. They had to run reverses just to get the ball in his hand. Like, freak athlete, his size, really fun to watch. I know he only ran like a 5. He was cleared at his program. He's gonna be really fun to watch. On the field, he is super athletic. I think the Falcons got a good one. Now, keep in mind, I think he's a good one for his role, which will be kick returner, gunner, punt returner, and then about a dozen snaps at most a game at receiver.
Yeah, I think probably where you're expecting Russell Gage usage is similar to what we saw with Andre Roberts last year. At least this year, we'll see if he can sort of expand on that. But I think Roberts only played like 30 snaps on offense and primarily was a special teams guy. I think that's primarily why the Falcons targeted him. In addition to Justin Bethel, I think his primary role is going to be as a gunner on punt teams, as well as on kickoff coverage. I think ideally what the Falcons hope that he's going to be is basically Eric Weems 2.0. Certainly, I think Gage brings some more potential to the offense than Eric Weems does, just because of the size and the athleticism that Weems never had. Or Weems was a better athlete than I think people realize, but certainly not from a size standpoint. But I don't necessarily imagine. It's hard for me to imagine a world where Russell Gage is more than the fifth wide receiver that occasionally gets reps on offense. I just feel like there's better options out there for the Falcons, and including several currently on the roster that have a little bit more upside offensively, or at least should be able to contribute a little bit more over the next year or so. So I think the interesting thing with Russell Gage is he started his career as a cornerback, so he's got the sort of size and arm length, because he's got 33-inch arms similar to Isaiah Oliver, and the type of athleticism that it wouldn't totally shock me if, after a year of him basically playing special teams, the Falcons decide, similar to what they've done with C.J. Goodwin and Deontay Burton, and basically say, you know what, why don't you move to cornerback next year? Leon McFadden and Bleedy Ray Wilson and Justin Bethel and those guys are all going to be gone, and you can sort of slide in and be, our main backup, our fifth cornerback at that spot, as opposed to our fifth wide receiver, where we might have some better options there. And so I could see that happening. I think he's going to be a very valuable special teams player, but as far as his potential on offense or defense, I don't expect a whole lot out of him there. I think he can add some depth there, but I don't think he's going to do much more than, say, what Nick Williams does in terms of his offensive contributions long term. Jason at your boy J94 asks, Russell Gage or Teddy Ginn? He looks nice, underutilized. It seemed with a bad quarterback. Is there enough upside to keep him at wideout and see what he turns into?
I think there's enough upside to keep him at receiver. I know Aaron's going to want to see him at corner eventually. But how many of these wide receiver to cornerback things actually work out? I wouldn't hate just keeping him at wide receiver. Atlanta keeps 6 receivers on the roster anyway. You might as well just have him as receiver. Worst case scenario, he's your 6th receiver. He's a cornerback in emergency situations. He's a gunner. He's a kick returner. He does all sorts of other things around the team where it doesn't matter if he's the 6th receiver on the offense. It's not like Nick Williams, where Nick Williams is basically useless outside of his little bit of snaps.
Okay. Well, look, I think that my issue with Russell Gage, from what I've seen of his, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't sat here and done a deep dive on him. That is something I plan to do on at some point the rest of the week. But from what I've seen of him, he did move to wide receiver. I think he only spent 1 year as a wide receiver at LSU and 3 years as a cornerback, if I'm not mistaken. So he's very raw as a wide receiver. The one concern I have with him is his route running is just basically non-existent at this point, which you can understand because he's only played 1 year as a wide receiver. But it's one of those things where I just don't see the Falcons putting in the time to sort of develop that. And I don't even necessarily know if the Falcons necessarily have the coaching staff in place that's going to really develop that type of player with Raheem Morris as the wide receivers coach. I don't necessarily know if that's really going to be where their strength is. And part of the reason why I think Ridley's in a position to be successful because he's already he's already a really good route runner, and they just got to refine it a little bit. But I think with Russell Gage, you kind of have to teach him how to run routes, which I just don't think NFL teams typically do at this point in time. And I just don't think his upside is quite enough on offense, any more so than a guy like a Reggie Davis a guy like a Marvin Hall or whoever else that the Falcons can throw at that position over the next year or so, that's going to merit you to be like, oh yeah, we definitely want to see where this guy is as far as his wide receiver potential. And so that's one of the reasons why I do think there's a possibility, not necessarily making a prediction, but a possibility that he could be moving the cornerback sooner rather than later. So that's where like I don't really see him as enough. I think he sort of maxes out as a Nick Williams type of receiver who can come on the field and give you like 1 or 2 catches a game, which is fine, but like not necessarily something that's like, oh man, that's a core element of our offense, and we really need Russell Gage to give us that 1 catch for 8 yards every single week. So,
well, if he can replace Nick Williams and Andre Roberts all in one receiver, he's worth the pick.
oh, like I'm not. Please don't get it wrong. I'm not saying that he wasn't worth the pick. I think he's going to be a huge asset to special teams. I think that's worth the 194th pick in the draft. I just don't see his future being this high level wide receiver to sort of say like, oh man, we're going to get like, you know, I don't see him turning into a Justin Hardy type. I don't see him turning into a Leonard Hankerson or something like that, or some other role player that we've had, a Devin Hester type at the wide receiver position. I don't see that, but you know, I certainly could be wrong about that, and we'll see how it goes. But I think he'll more than be worth his draft selection by what he brings on special teams again, because I think, as Mike Mayock said, I think he has the potential, like an Eric Weems, to be a 10-year career. Eric Weems has played 11 seasons in the NFL, primarily because of special teams, not because he's a great receiver. You know, I think that's really where Russell Gage's future is. Digital Demon asks, so do you see Russell Gage or Foye Sade Oluokun being anything more? Okay, I think we answered this, but I guess we can answer the Oluokun part. Anything more than special teams players?
I think Oluokun's definitely going to be a lot more than a special teams player. Dude is a good linebacker. He's got great ball skills. He knows how to use his hands when he's pass rushing. He's fun to watch. He has to eat a biscuit or two and gain some weight. And it's got to be good weight, too, because he has trouble shedding blocks. But he knows how to use his hands, and it's just from a lack of power. So when the technique's there, but he's still not shedding blocks, it says he needs strength. I don't think Yale has an NFL caliber strength training program. I could be wrong here, but I'm assuming that they're more worried about the books than the actual guys on the field.
Safe assumption.
Yeah, so I think if you put him in an NFL strength program and an NFL team for 2 full seasons, let him really learn the game, he may end up stealing a weak side linebacker job from Duke Riley. That's how good this kid could be. He's fun to watch.
Yeah, I think Oluokun definitely has upside to be more than a special teams player. I really like his coverage ability. I think he's very athletic. I think he can sort of see him being a similar player long term as a Kamal Ishmael, but because he has more athleticism and better coverage abilities than Ishmael does, I think you could see him as a better version of Kamal Ishmael long term. I think, unlike Kamal Ishmael, who was sort of forced into the lineup due to injuries at the safety position early in his career, I think Oluokun won't necessarily be forced to see the field early on, unless there are multiple injuries at that linebacker position. But I think because right now he's the 5th guy, you're going to be necessarily, you're going to have to see 2 injuries for him to see the field. So I think this year he'll probably be a special teams guy, but I think long term, 2-3 years down the road, he can certainly be a Kamal Ishmael type as sort of the team's top backup linebacker. I don't necessarily see him being a starter long term, but I certainly think his coverage abilities mean that, similar to a question we were asked earlier, where like you can sort of have him out there and play him in nickel and feel confident that he can handle himself in nickel. I also think, unlike a Kamal Ishmael, I think Oluokun has the athleticism to be able to play some safety more so than Ishmael is, because I think the further you put Ishmael away from the line of scrimmage, kind of the worse he is. I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case with Oluokun. You can argue that the closer you put him to the line of scrimmage, the less effective he is, just because most of his career he was a defensive back at Yale as opposed to a linebacker, so he's still learning that position. So I do think you can sort of have Oluokun be Keanu Neal's main backup at that strong safety position if you're in a pinch.
this season as an injury wise. So I think Aluakun has a lot of potential to develop, mainly because of that coverage ability. Okay, there you go. Let's well, Scott, you got anything else to add about Aluakun before we move on to some other draft related questions?
No, other than he's a former safety, he covers like it, and he will be very fun to watch in the Falcons scheme. He fits really well at that weak side backer.
Yeah. There's a lot of untapped potential there. It may take a year or two to crack it, but I do think people can be optimistic about his potential. Okay. Question from Luke is: when we look back, who is going to be the best Falcon from this draft?
I'm going to go a little wild here and say it's going to be Deadrin Senat. As good as Ridley is going to be, I think Senat could end up being that Brady Jarrett type pick where, yeah, Vic Beasley, Jalen Collins, Tevin Coleman were all great assets, but I still think he was the best pick. Now, there's a little caveat that he was the best value pick too, but he was the best pick in that draft. He's the most football ready in that.
Well, from a value standpoint, I feel like Isaiah Oliver is probably the best value that we got. And I do think if we're looking back years from now, who's going to, like 5 years from now, who are we going to look at and say, like, oh, he was the best pick from our 2018 class? You kind of hope it's Ridley. I mean, if it's not, then, I guess that's a testament to the other guys or I guess an indicator that maybe Ridley didn't live up to his potential as the best wide receiver in this draft class. But, I think Oliver, just to continue on the Oliver bandwagon, I think Oliver has the potential to be a player similar in terms of his potential as a Robert Alford level sort of quality cornerback that you can argue is a low end number one corner but a high end number two corner. I think he has that potential. I do wonder a little bit with Ridley whether or not he's going to break out of that, the equivalent of that at wide receiver. You hope that, in 5 years when Julio Jones is like, out there with a cane and probably, not necessarily the Julio Jones that we've known him to be for the last 7-8 years. You hope Ridley is going to be able to take over and be the main guy and be the sort of the go-to weapon towards the end of Matt Ryan's career. But I do wonder maybe if he has that potential in him. I mean, I think it's a fair question to raise that. I think there are some areas of his game, particularly with how well he deals with press and whatnot, that questions whether or not he can reach that potential. Like where you look at a guy like a Nelson Aguilar, like Aguilar is probably the best receiver on the Eagles, given where Jeffrey is at this point in his career. But I don't necessarily know if I would call Aguilar a number one receiver. So, I do wonder if maybe Ridley, that's the type of player he's going to be. So I think you can make a case for Isaiah Oliver, but I do think the smart money is on Calvin Ridley. Young Zach asked, do you think with the addition of this latest draft class, the Falcons are moving even more towards the finesse/speed spectrum? Do you think it will hurt them versus more physical teams? Are the Falcons just adapting to the new trend in the NFL?
I think they're just adapting to the NFL. I mean, I think they really are just making sure that they stay ahead of the curve and have the fastest roster out there.
I think the Falcons, looking at their draft, I think they sort of looked at it and say, our defense is already ascending. We need to figure out a way to get our offense back on track. And Calvin really does that for us. And I think when you make that claim in that case, I think it makes a lot of sense what they did in this draft. Do I think the more physical teams in the league will give them problems? Yes, because the more physical teams have always given the Falcons problems. I don't necessarily know if the Falcons are going to be able to play the Eagles or play the Vikings, arguably the two best teams in the NFC and arguably the two most physical teams in the NFC and out physical them. with the roster currently as is. But I don't necessarily know if they've really taken a step backwards away from that. I don't think they're, I mean, I maybe with the defensive line, maybe they're not as physical as they were a year ago, losing Poe and Claiborne, but I don't feel like it's a huge step back for them if there is a step back for them. So I don't think it really changes the math on that situation. I think, their goal is to be our defense is on the come up, and we just need to get our offense back on track to be that top 10, top 5 offense. And if we do that with our defense where it's expected to be, we'll be one of the better teams in the NFL. And I think that makes a lot of sense from their perspective. Okay, we will wrap up our draft-related questions with this one from Brian. What grade would you give our overall draft picks? Are there any areas that we didn't address that you think we should have?
I'd say it was a solid B. I just think the Falcons needed one more defensive tackle as opposed to Russell Gage.
Yeah, I think I would have been much happier if the Falcons had taken another defensive tackle. I feel like Deadrin Senat should have been the second defensive tackle they took in this draft, as opposed to the first guy. That's not a knock on Deadrin Senat, who's a player I really do like, but I don't necessarily know if he solves all the Falcons' issues on the interior of the defensive line. So I feel like for that reason, I would probably give it a solid B. I think draft grades are kind of ridiculous at this point in time, but because you got to give the people what they want. Yeah, it's a B draft. I think if Oliver and Ridley live up to their potential, I think long term it could be considered an A. If Senat is much better than I think he's probably going to be, if he winds up being much more of an every down player than I currently think he is, then you can certainly say that's going to push it more into the A plus range or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think it's a solid B at this point. Okay, Scott, you mentioned earlier that you don't think the Falcons are done at the defensive tackle position. Explain why you think that.
Because I think they should go out and get Jonathan Hankins. I wrote an article about it earlier this week. I just think that Hankins is the guy they need to really make their defense finalized, if you will. With Hankins, you'd have 2 deep at every single position on defense. Your weakest spot in your 2 deep would be your backup strong safety, who's Kamal Ishmael. That says a lot about how deep you are as a team. So yeah, I think if you had gone out and gotten Hankins and throw him right into that, starting role, and you let Senat work on his pass rush with the nickel grouping, and you have Hankins play more of that base Poe role where he's playing 60 to 65% of the snaps. Every first down, regardless of formation, and base formations on top of it. I just think it makes the team better. It gives Grady Jarrett someone experienced who can play that one technique really well next to him.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and say we shouldn't sign Jonathan Hankins because he was a guy that I thought they should have gone after last offseason. If they can afford him, if he was one of those guys that held out for a lot of money last year and wound up getting it from the Colts, I don't think he'll be cheap. It really sort of depends on sort of the Falcons, how much money they free up from re-signing Matt Ryan, how much money they free up from re-signing Jake Matthews. They're certainly going to get a sizable, chunk of cap from the Levine Toilolo cut in June. So, if they can create some cap space and Hankins is still unsigned by the time we get to, say, the end of this month or June or whatever, then I certainly think he is a very realistic possibility for the Falcons to pursue. But in the meantime, we'll have to see, because I do agree with you, Scott. I do feel like they definitely can't be planning to go into, or, I mean, they could be, but, it just seems weird for them to be like, okay, Jack Crawford, Grady Jarrett, and Deadrin Senat, you're going to be our main 3 guys, and you're going to basically be, the equivalent of what Poe, Crawford, and Jarrett were last year. And we saw how that worked out, how they had to go out and get Ataba Rubin midway through the season, even though they were also getting Courtney Upshaw off of the injury list midway through the season as well. So they really needed 5 defensive tackles to make it through last season, or 4, after Jack Crawford got hurt. So like they got to get another body there, and I don't know if that's going to be Jonathan Hankins or that's going to be somebody else. That's going to be one of these undrafted rookies, but it would be strange for me to see them open up training camp without getting at least somebody there. So I think Hankins is probably the best option out there. So of course, why not shoot for the best available player? I approve. Scott, do you have any call-outs this week before we move on to the rest of the mailbag questions?
Can't think of one.
Yeah, I don't really have one. I might have one next week or something, but yeah, I am too without anything grinding my gears. So let's jump into the rest of the mailbag. We got one from Bears Barroom. He asks, which veterans are now on the roster bubble?
Let's see. Looking at the roster, I mean, the only names that really stick out are like Ray Wilson and Pastor and like maybe Matt Schaub. I mean, it's a pretty set roster in terms of who the starters are, who the young guys are. I don't really see anybody who's like, oh my God, I'm not going to have a job, because I feel like they got rid of all those guys in the offseason. They got rid of the Sean Weatherspoons of the world this offseason.
Yeah, I feel like, when you're looking at guys where the team drafts a player and it's going to push guys out the door, you're typically looking at the team's first 4 picks. And we talked about sort of they don't have any D tackles really on the roster, so Deadrin Senat's not really pushing anybody out. Ito Smith, because Terrence McGee's the only other running back they had on the roster, and he was a long shot to make the roster anyway. Ito Smith's not really pushing a guy out. I think Matt Schaub is safe. I think the Falcons, gave guaranteed a portion of Kurt Benkert, their undrafted rookies signing bonus, which suggests that they plan on keeping him as the 3rd cornerback. I don't think they really see him as a number 2 option. Maybe Benkert comes in and pulls a Doug Johnson or a John Parker Wilson or a Dominique Davis and tears it up this summer. I wouldn't expect that, but we've seen that happen before with rookies looking really good to push a veteran out the door. We saw that with Chris Redman towards the end of his career. So it's possible, but I think it's doubtful. I think really the only players that really sort of move the needle is the cornerback position, with Isaiah Oliver sort of maybe potentially pushing some guys like Bleedy Ray Wilson and certainly Leon McFadden out the door. But I think, honestly, probably Bleedy Ray Wilson's probably going to make the team. If I was guessing right now, I just think McFadden's probably on the bubble now that Oliver's here. I think Justin Bethel's going to be safe. I think the wide receiver position, you've added 2 players at that spot. I think that's going to make it hard for guys like Devin Fuller and Marvin Hall and Reggie Davis to make the team. But I don't think it's really going to affect Justin Hardy or Mohamed Sanu or anybody like that. So, yeah, I would just say some low-end guys like a Bleedy Ray Wilson, a Marvin Hall, a Reggie Davis, Devin Fuller. Those guys might be on the bubble now as opposed to, before the draft. The fall of the Pats at Luez Abraham asks, I got bullied by a Bucks fan today saying Neal is just a big hit guy, no coverage skill. Deion Jones is a poor man's Quan Alexander. Our defense isn't any better than when Smith was here, and Ridley is just Gabriel but slower, no threat. What should I do? At Real Talk, Perez was the bully. How will the Bucks sorry-ass secondary stop Ridley, Sanu, and Jones?
Tell him to go sit the fuck down. And the entirety of the Falcons secondary team as a whole, outside of 3 players, is basically Mike Smithless now. There's 4 players from the Mike Smith era still on the defense. It's backup linebacker safety Kamal Ishmael, starting free safety Ricardo Allen, starting left corner Desmond Trufant, starting right Robert Alford, a.k.a. the only position that Mike Smith could actually scout somewhat. He couldn't even scout it that well because he cut Carter Allen to me. So yeah, the Falcons are way better than the Bucks on defense. There's no question. How will the Bucks sorry ass secondary stop Ridley and Jones? They won't. They could barely stop you and Jones and Flash. So, and everybody keeps forgetting about Austin Hooper. Why? That dude's gonna have a ridiculous year this year because everybody's gonna be so focused about everything else. You're gonna have going up against linebackers.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize that we were stopping, the no bullying campaign that's sweeping the nation. So, this podcast is on to big and better things. But yeah, I think the whole notion that the Falcons defense is like you can certainly question how good the Falcons defense is. Just certainly certain statistics suggest that they may not be the most amazing defense in the world. But like saying that they're not any better than they were when Mike Smith is here is just blatantly untrue. They were the worst defense in the league in 2014. They were one of the worst defenses in the league in 2013. Like they're clearly better than what they were when Mike Smith was here. All the other stuff is just your typical sort of trash talk where you try to act like certain players aren't as good as they want to be. As Scott said, look, the Bucks still haven't figured out how to stop Julio Jones. He's due for a 200-plus yard game against that defense every year. I don't really think they did anything to really move the needle in that guard in the draft. I think Carlton Davis is a good player. I think he will probably be asked to cover Julio Jones, but I don't think he's really ready for that. Question his fit in that defense just because Mike Smith isn't known for his penchant for playing a ton of press coverage, and that's really what you need to Carlton Davis to play. And then with the safety position, if they had drafted Derwin James, maybe I would have felt a little bit better about that secondary just because I think Derwin James instantly becomes the best player in that secondary, but I don't think they have anybody. Jordan Whitehead's a good player. He played at Pitt, so I'm a fan of his, but like he's not going to necessarily move the needle. He's more of a depth piece at that spot. So like the Bucks, like they're basically pinning all their hopes on their pass rush with Vinny Curry, who was kind of mediocre last season, with Noah Spence, who's been injury prone and been mediocre. Jason Pierre-Paul's good, not amazing. He's good. Vita Vea is a good player. Gerald McCoy is obviously Gerald McCoy. So they have some pieces that could, quote unquote, challenge the Falcons. They have a decent front seven, certainly better than what they were last year. But I don't see that front seven really getting after Matt Ryan to the degree that they need to on the level of an Eagles defensive line or a Vikings defensive line to sort of mask the fact that they really have struggles matching up in the secondary, particularly against a Julio Jones. And I think now with a guy like Ridley in the mix, that's only going to be more problematic for this Bucs defense in the future. So, if you can, Luez, maybe you can use that to, get this bully off your back. And, I don't know. We got our last couple of questions from Evan Birchfield. He asks, which NFL team had the best draft?
I think the Browns did. They focused on all the pillars that they needed to focus on. They got good players at all their spots that they needed them. The only thing that I would criticize is maybe they should have gotten Connor Williams and Austin Corbett in that second round. But other than that, I think the Browns had arguably the best draft out there.
I'm going to go with the Arizona Cardinals. They got the best quarterback in the draft. It changed, the future of their team. I think in a similar way that the Matt Ryan pick did for the Falcons 10 years ago. I think getting Josh Rosen, trading up to get Josh Rosen and only giving up a third-round pick and a fifth-round pick. I have no idea who else the Cardinals took in the draft. I guess they either got Christian Kirk or whatever. He's a decent slot receiver, so he can be sort of the heir apparent to Larry Fitzgerald. But if Josh Rosen is as good as I think he's going to be and other people think he's going to be, that's the best draft because that's the team that's going to put themselves in a position, whether it's 3 to 5 years from now or for the next 10 to 12 years, going to put themselves in a position to compete at the highest levels if they got a legitimate top 10 franchise quarterback. So That's my answer for that question. Grade the NFC South drafts. Another question from Evan.
I mean, I don't know. I thought the Saints did a piss poor job. If I had to give them a grade, I'd say a D at best. They needed a pass rusher, but trading up a first-round pick for next year, when they probably won't have Drew Brees, to get Marcus Davenport. Traquan Smith I had as a seventh-round player on my board. Rick Leonard I had as an undrafted player. H.O. Jamerson I had as undrafted. Their sixth and seventh round picks were okay. Their best value pick was Will Clapp at LSU. Their best pick in probably 3 years will be Will Clapp at LSU starting for them in center. Like, I just don't see a great draft out of the Saints. The Buccaneers, very reactionary. Defensive tackle, running back, top two needs. But then, offensive tackle, they basically drafted positions that were like, oh hey, Falcons got wide receivers, Saints got pass rushers, the Panthers did this. Let's draft players that kind of counteract, which get it, but it's draft players that. Now the Panthers, I thought they got a solid. Got wide receiver. Because I don't think Ball plays back there. Got a solid tight end. Pass rush specialist. They had a good first 4 rounds. I don't love their 5th or 7th round pick. The 5th and 7th round. When it comes to grades, you worry about the top picks. So, D, I think the Panthers probably got B. Then just think about
Looking at their drafts, I thought the Saints didn't do a great job with the trade up to Marcus Davenport. I think the Panthers, I actually kind of like DJ Moore more than Calvin Ridley in a vacuum as a prospect, but I do think Calvin Ridley as a fit in Atlanta versus DJ Moore as a fit in Carolina. The Ridley pick, I think, is a better fit for what they're going to ask him to do. I still have questions about how Carolina is going to deploy their weapons around Cam Newton. And while I think DJ Moore is a more talented receiver than Calvin Ridley is, I don't know if he's necessarily going to live up to the billing that they want him to in Carolina. Looking at their draft, I don't really know if Deontay Jackson really moves the needle for them in terms of having a fast slot guy in this division where you don't necessarily really have, like, I guess Ridley's going to be the only guy that you really were worried about matching up with long term. That you look at a guy like Dante Jackson in terms of that fit. I like Marquise Haynes. He's a player I really liked at Ole Miss for many, many years. But if I'm looking at their drafts, I think Tampa Bay had the best draft, if only for the reason that they drafted all players that I have actually heard of and have a good idea of what they're going to be. So I think they got the most talent in this draft. Every single one of those guys, I'm like, oh yeah, I know who that guy is. I've seen a little bit of that guy. I've heard people say good things about that guy. So if I was grading them, I would probably like Saints are like a C minus, Carolina's like a C plus, and Carolina's like a B minus or something. I mean, Tampa Bay is like a B minus or something. So like that's probably where I would go. Evan's next question is: was there a position you were surprised the Falcons didn't address more in the draft?
Yeah, defensive tackle. They probably should have had 2 instead of just 1.
Yeah, I think that's the answer right there. I'm trying to think, like, did I think they were going to draft another position? I thought they would take a D tackle. I think they would take 2 D tackles, a linebacker, a wide receiver, a cornerback. Yeah, those were the only positions and maybe a running back. Those are the only positions I really thought they definitely would take. So yeah, that second D tackle is really the only spot. Evan next asks, predict the Falcons wide receiver core for Week 1.
Julio Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Calvin Ridley, Justin Gage, Marvin Hall, Justin Hardy. In those particular order.
Yeah, you rattled them off so fast, Scott. I don't know if mine is the exact same way.
Hardy, Hall, Gage, Sanu, Ridley, Jones.
Okay, yeah, that's
last year's core, but with Russell Gage and Ridley instead of Gabriel and Roberts.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, Scott got it. Those 6. Any thoughts on the undrafted free agent signings?
One's gonna start at fullback, and maybe one more is gonna make the roster at linebacker. The rest, I see a lot of camp.
Yeah, I haven't really watched. I watched the fullbacks. I've seen some of Kurt Bankert. I was very impressed with him. A couple of other guys I've heard
Marks,
of.
Man.
Marks is the best out of between him and McKitt, whatever his name is. I think he's better.
But Marks is good. I had a draftable grade on Marks, which for a fullback, like even having a draftable grade means they're pretty solid.
He's okay. He's okay.
I don't expect him to play more than 10% of the snaps. And I think as a special teamer, that's where he's really going to earn his keep.
He's okay to me. I think he's decent. He's decent. That's what I'll say. I don't know. I think if he's our fullback, we'll probably have the worst fullback in the league for the second year in a row. So that's what I'll say.
Well, then let's definitely hope McNitt doesn't win the job because McNitt would be worse.
That's probably true. It's probably true. So I think Marks is the better of the two. Jake Rowe, the tight end from Boise State, might also get a look there. I think Jake Rowe's a pretty decent H-back. I don't know if he's necessarily a good fullback, so that will be something we'll have to see in training camp or whatever. So, right now I'm not full with optimism and positivity about the fullback position being significantly or any better, really, than it was a year ago. So we'll see how that plays out. But obviously, who knows with undrafted free agents. Evan asks, do you think the Falcons have more faith in Jack Crawford than people expect?
Probably. I don't think that people were expecting them to be like, oh, hey, Maurice Hurst is just sitting here, round 4. Let's pass up on him for Ito Smith. Like, I don't think anybody was expecting that. But I think they like Crawford. I think Dan Quinn sees something in Crawford that a lot of us don't, and maybe he's right because he's the defensive line expert.
Look, Crawford was decent for the 4 games he played last year. He flashed potential. I don't know if Crawford is good. Again, like I said, I don't know if Crawford's good enough that I would be like, yeah, get that guy, 60% of the snaps or whatever the case may be, and we'll be cooking. Like, I don't have that much confidence in Jack Crawford, but I certainly think it's clear that the Falcons have a lot more confidence in Jack Crawford than most people thought they did. But as we discussed earlier, I don't feel like they have enough confidence, or they shouldn't have enough confidence in Jack Crawford to not make at least one signing between now and the start of training camp. So, yeah. All right. Our last question from Evan Birchfield is, what will be your reactions when people start asking rookie minicamp questions in the near future?
You see my eyes rolling to this question? It'll be very similar to those questions. Ricky Minicamp tells us nothing.
Yeah, there's always one guy that, like Von McClure says, oh, this guy looked really good, or D-Led says it or something like that, and people jump on the bandwagon, oh, this guy's going to be great or whatever the case may be. And sometimes it's, that guy at least does enough to make the team. But at this juncture, yeah, if people ask us rookie minicamp questions, it's going to be like, I don't know, man. Like, basically nothing happens between now and the last week of July, other than, the Falcons making a couple of roster moves with some extensions, maybe picking up a Jonathan Hankins, but like nothing on the football field, at least from my perspective. Not to say it doesn't matter, but it's just not going to necessarily mean anything to me. Like, obviously, they're installing the offense and guys are getting up to speed, so it matters to the players and certainly to the coaches. But at least from my perspective, like nothing over the next 3 months on the football field is going to matter to me. So I'm sure people will ask these questions, and we will roll our eyes. But if you do want to ask rookie minicamp questions or any other questions, you can use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. Send it over to myself on Twitter at FalcFans. Scott is at Karasik S. I hope it is somewhere on the screen where you guys can see it, somewhere below. And you can also use the Twitter handle of the show at FalconsPFC. Check us out on ProFootballCentral.com, as well as subscribe to the Pro Football Central channel on YouTube. You can also give us a like on Facebook at Falcons Central Radio. Make sure that you never miss another second of the show when we go live. So I guess, Scott, we have to ask the question of, are we going to be back next week if there's nothing really to talk about?
I'm going to go with no. If there's nothing to really talk about, like, should we be back next week?
So there's a good chance we'll go back to the every other week format to get through the summer. And that's where you guys can certainly help fill in the content of the show with your mailbag questions. So we definitely will recommend you guys sending those questions to us in the next week or two. So until then, guys, we appreciate it. And we'll be back in 2 weeks unless something major happens. And then we'll let you know. But again, that's why you should follow us on Twitter. And we'll give you those updates.